My name is Dan Frier. Thank you for your patience. We're going to start off nice and slow. I'm going to talk about general things, but my hope today is to talk about really specific internist and nephrologist out of Englewood Hospital. And when I was a little kid, whenever I felt sick, my father would put on his stethoscope. He'd come over to me and he'd take his finger, his middle finger, and he would percuss his finger with his other finger. He'd make this incredible noise with it. And I'd always try to copy it, but he'd do it, percuss my stomach, percuss my chest. If I had something wrong with my toe, he'd percuss my toe, which I later found out was impossible. And inevitably, I felt better. I watched him do it to my sister. She felt better. I did rounds with him at the hospital once, and I saw him do the same thing to an old man, and I became totally convinced that this was how my father practiced medicine. He would just walk around percussing people. I'm telling you the story because I was influenced greatly by having a father who's a doctor, and as an attorney, you know, I think in life you should have a mission. You should have an underlying mission for everything that you do. And it should be more than just making money. Obviously, we all try to make a living, but there should be some mission. And my mission is I believe in the private practice of medicine. I believe that I know that physicians are the only players in a three-part system where there's physicians, hospitals, and managed care companies. Physicians are the only part of that know how to practice medicine, that know anything about patient care. Hospital administrators, they typically know nothing about patient care. But the other two elements in that triad are so much more powerful than physicians, and physicians have lost a tremendous amount of power. And truly, I've seen the private practice of medicine threatened. So we're going to talk about, you know, my vision of how to fix that a little bit. And we're going to start with talking about some of the market forces. This is the only chart I'm going to show. This just shows how medical inflation has outpaced the CPI dramatically since around 1985. And as you know, fee schedules have not kept up with that, so there's downward pressure on the take-home pay of physicians. Treatment of chronic hip pain in 1960. That was about it. Doesn't cost a lot of money. Treatment of chronic hip pain in 2016 is a titanium hip. So this is one of the reasons that healthcare has gotten more expensive. People will tell you, a lot of people will tell you that the fact that healthcare costs have increased is a bad thing. It's a terrible thing. We have to fix it. I don't agree with that at all. This is an example of an increased cost being a good thing. We wouldn't want to go back to 1950 when you can only take an aspirin. We have modalities now that are incredibly effective but incredibly expensive, and we don't have a system that has figured out how to deal with that disparity. And we need to do it. And so whether you like it or not, there's going to be immense pressure in the next few years to try to bridge that gap, and a lot of that pressure is going to fall on physicians. Another market factor that affects you guys in particular is the reduction of out-of-network benefits, increases in co-pays and deductibles, higher premiums for out-of-network plans, reduction in out-of-network reimbursement, and merging of large insurers results in a decrease in negotiating leverage for physicians. Even physicians who are in-network should be very happy about a vigorous, robust out-of-network system, because traditionally, going out-of-network was the threat, the sort of Damocles that you could hold over the insurance companies if they didn't treat you properly. If you don't pay us reasonably, if you don't treat us properly and pay us timely, we're going to go out-of-network. It's going to cost you a lot more money. That threat is becoming unrealistic. It's no longer a realistic threat in most marketplaces. MACRA. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into MACRA. You've heard lectures on it. Suffice it to say, it's incredibly complicated. This is what I'll say about MACRA. I mean, I've read the law. I've read a commentary on it. I still don't fully understand it, and I'm a lawyer. And it doesn't bother me too much because to me, MACRA is just one of many things that are going to come up in the future that are going to affect physicians. It's just a symptom of the need to control costs while maintaining quality. There are going to be many systems. Why should you care about it? You should care about it because some form of it is going to impact you, whether it's MACRA itself, whether it's private insurance companies that implement something. In my marketplace, we practice out of New Jersey. We do work in probably 18 or 19 states. But New Jersey, I can tell you that there is a very, some of the insurance companies, I'll get into it in a moment, some of the insurance companies are already very active in trying to come up with alternative payment models. triple aim, you've all heard about it. That's the goal of macro. That's the goal. I'm going through some of these slides quickly because I don't have too much time. Again, you've heard about MIPS in a previous discussion. One of the reasons I'm showing you this slide is that if you look at the bottom, you're going to be judged on quality, resource use, clinical practice improvement, meaningful use of certified EHR systems. All of these things require a level of sophistication that, in my opinion, small, unsophisticated medical practices will not be able to handle in the future. And I'm very concerned that a lot of my clients, particularly in specialties like yours, are happy and content being in small practices because right now it feels good. You have this immense autonomy. You're still making a decent living. I don't think that's going to be the case in years to come. And as Wayne Gretzky said, I don't go where the puck is, I go where the puck is going to be. And the puck here is going to be in being able to achieve these four mechanisms in one, whether it's through the macro system or some other system. APMs, alternative payment models. The reason I'm bringing up this is later on I'm going to talk about something that might be of interest to you, because I think there's a possibility for a pain episode of care, which could be your own APM. I'll get into that in a moment. The time frame for MIPS in 2019, by 2019, there will be adjustments. By 2022, the adjustments will be as high as 9%. So again, I'm flipping through these slides. The most important thing to understand is this. If you have a 50% overhead in your practice, and you have a downward adjustment of 9% because you are a small practice that can't keep up with the level of sophistication needed for the reporting and the compliance with MACRA, that 9 or 10% decrease is 18 to 20% of your profits. You will go out of business. And that's the case whether it's MACRA or some other form of alternative payment model. I was having lunch literally 3 weeks ago with a very high-level executive for one of the Blue Cross Blue Shield providers, this woman is responsible for value-based care, alternative payment models. We were talking about episodes of care, and she explained to me how they're doing it, and I think it's important for you to understand this because there's an opportunity here. What she said was they're using an episode of care, but there are really two types of episodes of care. There are bundled payments, which is a prospective episode, and I'll explain in a second. And then there are shared savings, which is a retrospective type of episode of care. So the prospective episode of care, which is the most commonly talked about episode, is an insurance company pays you X dollars for a hip replacement, and that includes the cost of inpatient care, that includes the cost of the pre-surgical treatment, the surgery itself, the post-acute care, physical therapy, everything that happens. And she was saying to me, the problem with that is not that physicians can't manage that, and not that we can't get hospitals to manage that risk to some extent. It's that the insurance companies can't figure out how to do it. And they can't figure out how to do it because if someone goes outside of that episode, let's say they get their physical therapy outside of the episode, we, the insurance company, we've already paid for the episode. How do we deal with that? Our systems just aren't as sophisticated as you might think they are. We're worth billions of dollars. We have no idea how to deal with that. That prospective methodology is too complicated for them, even if you could figure it out. My partner John Maroney and I have been very involved for many years in developing these prospective systems. The problem is getting insurance companies to figure out how to pay for it. So what she was saying is they adopt a retrospective system. And the way that works is essentially the physician bills fee for service. At the end of the episode, whether it's it could be any episode. It could be a chronic back pain episode. It could be an endoscopy episode. It could be a hip replacement episode. At the end of that episode, we compare. We judge you by outcome. We want to know how quickly you resolve the issue, how successful were you in resolving the issue, and then we judge the cost. We compare the amount of money it costs for you to go through that episode versus some benchmark that's risk adjusted. If you meet the quality outcome measures, we don't care how you get there. We're not going to tell you how to practice medicine. We're not going to tell you that you have to do X, Y, and Z in order to achieve this. You figure that out within your own practice. We just want good results, and we want you to save us money. And if you save us money, we're going to share that savings with you. And I have clients. I have a large OB/GYN group. They have about 120 doctors. They have an obstetrical episode that's this retrospective episode, and they're getting checks every quarter for significant amounts of money. I bring this to your attention because I do think that there is an opportunity, because at the end of this discussion with this woman, she said, without even mind mentioning it, she said, I would love to put together a chronic pain episode of care. I just need ideas. I would love to hear your ideas after this discussion. I'd love you guys to contribute to my knowledge base so that I can help come up with this and be a bridge for you guys to negotiate this, or just talk to this person about it. I think she's waiting for something like that. Challenges to traditional private practices. Some of the pressures, hospitals buying primary care practices. Now they're starting to buy specialty practices. I thought that would never happen. I'm seeing a lot of my specialty clients approached by hospitals. Hospitals feel this increasing need to avoid their specialists going to other hospitals. So they don't want to own physician practices because they lose money on them, but they feel compelled to in order to maintain market share, basically. The government cuts in reimbursement, Medicare audits, MACRA, all these things are difficult situations for a small practice to deal with. Audits alone are difficult. The clients that I have who are small practices, they don't have the sophistication within their office to deal with a major audit. And they end up having to have outside consultants. They have to spend a lot of money on legal fees. Larger groups that I have, a lot of them don't even need to contact an attorney for some of these basic audits. They have very sophisticated individuals that work directly for them who can deal with those issues. Insurance companies, we're seeing a lot of private equity. I don't look at this as a bad thing, but private equity is a challenge. It's a competitor for the small private practitioner, because private equity companies are coming in, and what they're doing is they can't own medical practices in the vast majority of states, but they can own management companies that manage those medical practices. You see that with anesthesia, the Sheridans of the world, the Napas of the world, paying huge amounts of money. I have a client that got 13 times earnings from one of the big parties in anesthesia group to sell their anesthesia company, including pain management and everything. These are your competitors. Now, are my clients happy once they go into this system? No. They're happy because their bank accounts are swollen, but they're not happy with how they practice medicine anymore. Other challenges, non-physician providers. It's interesting, if you track the history of what these non-physician providers have been called, and this is not to disparage at all because I think clearly they're necessary, but if you look at the history of what they've been called over the years, it's fascinating. They used to be called limited license practitioners, and they were called mid-level providers, physician extenders, allied health professionals, independently licensed professionals. As their titles have gotten more, they've gotten closer and closer to physicians. And in some sense, they're your competitors, but you have to just live with that reality, and you have to adjust to that new situation. Another competitor is urgent care centers. Hospitals are opening up these urgent care centers. Patients with chronic pain, patients with pain, patients with an issue are going to the urgent care centers, and they're being directed into hospital practices. They're being directed away from private practices. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for urgent care within the pain management field as a feeler into the marketplace. I have OB/GYN clients that have urgent care centers for patients that have issues late at night. I have other specialties that are using urgent care for their narrow needs of their patients. Something to consider. Telemedicine providers. If you're a small practice with a brick and mortar shop, you can't really reach beyond where patients can drive to you, which is a relatively small radius. And if you're treating a patient for chronic pain, the radius gets smaller because people aren't going to travel a great distance if they have to go to you on a regular basis. Telemedicine providers are a disruptive technology, so to speak, for your practices. The greatest threat to the private practice of medicine, he's off the air now, but the physicians. So physicians, all my clients are physicians for the most part. My father's a physician. I love physicians. I get physicians. I just get along with them. I understand how they think. Smart, scientifically minded people who care for other people. But as you know, they don't, I'm not saying you because I don't know you individually, but for the most part, physicians have a difficult time with change. Physicians have a difficult time joining large groups and collaborating and playing in the sandbox with other physicians. and that has made you very vulnerable. So let's talk about small practices and some of the issues with small practices. There's high overhead, administrative burdens that clog up your time instead of practicing medicine, technology costs, which are going to become even more important with MACRA and other programs in the future. Lack of sophistication means inability to evolve. You have no leverage with payers at all. You really can't, because of the stark definition of group practice and the requirements, you really can't engage in significant ancillary services. I see small groups that have do some of their own lab work. A lot of them do it improperly. A lot of them do it in violation of Stark because they don't have sophistication to understand what needs to be done. If you're a large group practice, you can sustain ancillary revenues and meet the definition of group practice under Stark. And you can't compete with hospitals in large groups, or you won't be able to in the future. You may be able to do it now. You may feel I'm small, I'm agile, I can move quickly. Those qualities are going to be superseded by just the sheer weight and strength of a large group. Opportunities, expansion with integration. So the gold standard of physician integration, we're going to be talking about two types of integration. We're going to be talking about, here's the formation of an integrated group medical practice as one form. And then we're going to talk about clinically integrated networks, which is I'll call it an integrated medical practice a light version of this. So an IGP, integrated group practice. Before this is what it looks like before the formation. You have a series of individual practices who have no relationship with one another, have no clinical integration, and you might see them at the hospital or you may see them at the surgery center, and that's the extent of the relationship. In order to form a group practice, you can form an entity, usually an LLC. I've done probably 30 or 30 plus of these, multi-specialty, single specialties. Every single one of them is an LLC because LLCs are incredibly flexible organizations. You can divide profits any way you want, pretty much. You can have management work. You can have different classes of stock, unlike an S corporation where you can only have one class of shareholder. Each of if you look at this, how this slide works, each of the individual practices becomes a care center within the limited liability company. A care center is just a division within the practice. It is not itself an entity, a legal entity. So the little circles inside the yellow circle are just divisions. They don't have their own legal identity. The individual practices that were previously the practices through which the physicians saw patients become holding companies. This is one way of doing it, and a simple way of doing it. The prior practices become holding companies that lease their assets, lease their space over to the new LLC. You can keep those entities in existence so that if someone wants to unwind from this thing, if it doesn't work out, then you can back up into it and you have the practice still there with all of its assets still in place. So you can just reconstitute it. The care centers within the LLC operate after the go-live date very much, almost exactly the way that the practices operated before they entered the organization, with the one difference being that everybody bills through a single tax ID number. And that allows for a number of things. It allows for compliance with Stark for any ancillary services. It allows for negotiation with third-party payers with a much reduced risk of antitrust violation. And it allows the beginning of clinical integration because you have shared IT, you have shared systems, shared medical records, and the ability to produce data, basically. And the way that the finances work, I could spend a lot more time on explaining this, but this is more of a cursory discussion. The way that the finances work is the LLC bills for all the services of all of the physicians in each of the care centers. When revenue comes in, money is taken out to pay for the centralized cost, and then the money is divided among the owners of the members of each care center based upon what they produced, minus whatever expenses that care center incurred. So that we set it up this way because it ensures that each care center continues to eat what it kills. Each care center can continue to pay the expenses that it wants to pay. If it wants to pay, $40 a square foot for rent, it can continue to do that. If it doesn't, then it can pay less. It doesn't care what other physicians do because it's not affected by those decisions. my experience with this is as follows. I have sat down with, hundreds of times with physicians to talk about the formation of group practices, and I would say my success rate is probably 15 or 20% in getting physicians to agree to do this. Sometimes they don't do it for good reasons. They have other goals. Sometimes they don't do it just because they have this incredible inertia, and they lack the ability to just make that final decision. These are tough things to do, but I will tell you that of all the groups that I've formed that have gotten to the go live date, there's not a single group that has failed once it gets to that point. They've all succeeded. I'm not taking credit for that. Just the nature of these large practices. They work. So, these large group practices, they offer individual care center autonomy so that essentially you continue to do what you want to do and you don't do what you don't want to do. The good analogy is you have it's like having fractional ownership of a 747 instead of owning a small propeller plane. You can have someone at the higher level of this organization who's an MBA, who's a very sophisticated individual that a small practice could never afford to hire. You can have access to that even if you're essentially a solo out in the boondocks, never being able to have that kind of access. If you're part of a larger group, you can have access to that, and that's incredibly valuable. Reduced overhead. Most of the groups that I work with, they do have some reduced overhead. In order to do that, you're trading basically some of the infrastructure inside your practice for the centralized cost. So if you don't cut some of your infrastructure internally, then you're just going to experience the cost increase most likely. So there has to be some level of paring down within your practice in order to achieve economies of scale. Reduced administrative burdens, shared technology, ability to manage risk. Risk meaning the types of risk models that we're talking about, bundled payment models, things like that. And as we talked about, implementing ancillary services. There's a lot of issues to be considered in the formation of a large group practice. Who should be part of that? My experience is that you want the groups to be as large as you can get them to be. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous, but the bigger the better, generally, while maintaining quality. But you're going to have to resign yourself to the fact that some of the people that you partner with are not necessarily people that you would want to practice in the same office as. You don't have to be. Physicians have a tendency when we're talking about these groups to come up with reasons not to do this, not to join forces with somebody. Well, I don't like the way he practices, or he's a pain in the ass, or he insulted me one day. That's been perfect for the insurance company. That's been perfect for hospitals because it's prevented you from doing anything that's unified you. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a room and the discussions have broken down because the people can't agree on whether they should pay for health insurance for their employees or not in this new group. We're talking about decisions that are worth tens of thousands of dollars affecting decisions that are worth millions of dollars. Who should be invited is one of them. Establishing leadership. Any group practice needs to have strong physician leadership. You can't leave this all to MBA types. Every successful group that I work with has a strong physician leader on top of the strong business leaders. Governance. I mean, I could spend a lot of time talking about governance, but certainly when these groups get formed in the early stages, the only way you're going to attract people is if you give everybody a vote, if you give everyone an equal say. If you start creating different classes in an organization that has nothing to show yet, no successes, nobody's going to join. As the organization becomes more successful, it can pare that down. It can have different classes of owners. But in the early stages, as you're growing, you're going to need to be egalitarian. As I talked, classes of ownership, level of integration. This just gets to the question of how integrated you want to be. Clinical integration. If you want to do any kind of contracting, you're going to need to show a level of clinical integration. But I will say this: you don't have to be clinically integrated to do everything that you want to do as a group practice. For example, if you want to negotiate an episode of care with an insurance company, you have to be integrated within that episode. That doesn't mean you have to be integrated with every single thing that you do beyond that. Within that episode, you need to be integrated, and the fact is you can't possibly be successful in an episode unless you are integrated. So a lot of physicians, I think, are reluctant to start these things or join groups because on day one the group isn't fully clinically integrated. And I think you have to be more realistic. I think you have to realize that clinical integration takes time, and it has to be done typically piecemeal. Profit distributions, we talked about that a little bit. One thing about profit distributions I'll mention is that under Stark, DHS profits have to be distributed in a very, very specific way. They can't be distributed based upon who referred what. But there are creative models that can be used. There's a rule called the division of 5 rule, which allows divisions of 5 physicians or more to divide those DHS revenues that they produced. That's a very powerful rule that a lot of groups aren't using, and it allows you to say to a group that's geographically located, let's say 50 miles away from another set of physicians, we're not going to dilute your DHS revenue by sharing it with everyone in the group, but we're going to let you share it with the 5 physicians that are in your geographic area. And that allows, that's an amazing concession that's in Stark. I don't even understand how it got there, but it's there. Restrictive covenants, you have to make a decision whether this group is going to be easy to get into and easy to get out of. If you make it easy to get out of, more people will want to join. That's all I can say. The harder it is to get out, the more intimidating it will be for people to join the organization. I'm going to finish my last 2 minutes talking about clinically integrated networks. Who has heard of CINs before? Okay. Most of you have not. You're going to hear the word CIN, clinically integrated networks, constantly now that I've mentioned it once, just the way things work. So a clinically integrated network is, I'll call it an IPA on steroids. Remember the IPA format? Physicians join forces, they sign an operating agreement, and they start negotiating contracts through a messenger model to try to avoid antitrust violations. The vast majority of IPAs failed because they were antitrust, they were violations of antitrust law. The messenger model that just wasn't an effective way to negotiate contracts. Clinically integrated networks are like, they say like, when bell bottoms come back, they're going to come back, but they're going to be a little bit different. This is IPAs coming back a little bit different. Okay, a clinically integrated network is an organization that was born as a result of the fact that there are now waivers to the antitrust rules, waivers to Stark anti-kickback, as long as you're clinically integrated and you can prove that you're providing high quality care. So a clinically integrated network just simply involves a selected partnership of physicians collaborating with hospitals and other providers to deliver evidence-based care, improve quality and efficiency, manage populations, and demonstrate value. Once these objectives are met, then the organization can legally contract. So to form a CIN, this is before, you don't have to include hospitals and pharmacies or ASCs, but you can just be a medical practice CIN. You could be a large group that creates a CIN. Let's say, for example, you have a large group, but you feel that there's other doctors in the marketplace that aren't willing to join your group, but you still want them to be involved in the process. You can create a CIN, and these other groups can participate in it without actually having to become full-fledged members of the organization. And once they participate, they sign participation agreements, and they can then agree to participate in whatever alternative fee structure arrangements you're negotiating, whether it be an episode of care or whatever. So like the integrated group practice, you'd form the CIN, and it's a very simple legal structure where basically you have owners and you have participating providers. So some of the physicians would be owners of the CIN, and some would be simply participating providers. And the function of the CIN is to allow those groups of participating providers to contract with third-party payors to engage in typically not fee-for-service, something like either the prospective or retrospective type episodes of care we were talking about before, all the way up to global risk contracting if you can get that sophisticated. I have I'll end on this note because my time is pretty much up. I have one client that has a hospital nearby and they're very scared because the hospital wants to form a CIN. And the hospital's attitude is this. The hospital has bought up a bunch of practices, but they've saturated, they're fully saturated in terms of the practices that they think they can buy. None of the other physicians in the area are willing to sell to the practice. Typically, the practices that sold to the hospital were the practices that consisted of the older physicians who are ready to retire, maybe the weaker practices that weren't doing so well. And the hospital realizes that if it wants to compete in the marketplace, it has to extend its umbrella over a much wider swath of physicians, including those physicians who are independent. So the hospital is forming this CIN, and it wants it had this huge meeting with all these physicians who were outside of their practice to join the CIN. And my clients, a bunch of these physicians came to me and said, what do we do? And I said, well, the first thing you should do is you form your own organization, and then that organization should contract with the hospital so that you're negotiating as a single unit. Otherwise, the hospital is going to say to Dr. Smith, this is what we're going to pay you. Dr. Jones, this is what we're going to pay you. And if you don't accept this, you're not going to get our volume. And we're going to control the volume in this market now because we're big and we're strong and we have the relationships with payers. So I said, in order to avoid that, form your own little sub-CIN, which we're doing right now, which contracts with the hospital CIN. And the nice thing about that is that the sub-CIN doesn't have to have sophisticated technology. You just have to have a legal structure, proper governance, and it can last. So as you see these hospital CINs forming in your area, which they probably will, keep some of these things in mind and try to use it as an opportunity. Key components. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail. Similar issues that we dealt with in the integrated group practices. And that's it. Thanks, guys.